Well, thank you very much, James. Hello, everybody. So first of all, thank you so much for inviting me along to speak. It's a bit of a crazy honour for me whenever I get invited to speak at anything. The idea that anyone is even remotely interested in what I'm going to say is quite an odd one to me. But at the same time, I've been saying related messages for a few years, and I've noticed a fair few people picking up on them. So maybe there's a few things I'm going to say tonight which are either going to challenge, affirm, or you're just going to tell me I'm wrong. And if I'm wrong, oh crikey, please tell me, because I'm still learning. You know, one of the great things about Agile and agility is it doesn't stop. You know, you don't read the Agile Manifesto, a 2-decade-old document, and the principles behind it, and then stop learning. So I'm always wanting to learn more about Agile, about Lean, etc. So if anything I say is missing the mark completely based on your experience, crikey, tell me, and I'll learn from that. It's great. Anyway, so who am I? Well, I work as head of Agile development. I had to remind myself then because my job title changed about a month ago. So I work as head of Agile development for Capita DDC, Digital Development Centre in the UK, and I've got teams in the UK, teams over in India, and although I don't work directly with them at the moment, but that will change in the not too distant future, teams in Poland and South Africa. So it's a proper almost worldwide company. We haven't got USA yet for any of my teams. But those teams are people that I rely on every single day to essentially solve problems, to deliver value, etc. And that's what's really important to me. And I was head of product and innovation for Capita until I became head of Agile development in this particular area that I work in, the Digital Development Centre. And my focus is 50% pure, more technical, 50% product, and 50% Agile. And I know that doesn't add up to 100%, but honestly, that's the way my day feels sometimes. You know, with the amount of hours I have to cram in and the amount of work I've got to cram in sometimes. So it's a very kind of cross-disciplinary kind of role. My background is that I come from a university background. So can I just check something? I am actually sharing screen one, aren't I? I'm trying to look at what's sharing. Can you see my slide deck? It's a correct question.
You are indeed. No, you're sharing all good.
I'm getting some weird messages. Zoom is very strange on my computer today, and I'm not going to touch anything because it will just tell me to reboot again. Sorry, so start again. So I come from a university background, like many people do, and that gave me one clear head start in my my career, which initially wasn't IT, but very quickly became IT, like many people. And that is that my degree was pretty much focused on critical thinking. So it's a degree in environmental science. Now, I'll be honest, I came out of that degree and crikey, my critical thinking skills were all over the shop, and they needed a lot of shaping by kind of friends, colleagues, my other half. And eventually I kind of got there. And then you roll forward all the way to today, and you know, just over 2 decades later, you know, I'm running multiple teams around the world. Fantastic, you know, etc. So I've gone from this kind of semi-critical thinking background to what I would say a lean thinking background, but it's lean thinking based on critical thinking, evidence, and analysis. So that's where I come from. And I got asked to speak not too long ago at a Unicom conference, and you know what, I took a massive gamble at that one. So my subject there was how lean is your Scrum? And it was not having a railing go at Scrum as such, but maybe let's say the culture and the industry of Agile that has become, let's face it, Scrum. You know, many companies, when they're getting an Agile consultant, the first thing they say is, let's do Scrum. And I see that over and over again. I actually had a bit of a dig at that. And I said, look, Scrum is very, very good in the context for which Scrum is very, very good. You know, Kanban is good when Kanban is good, etc., etc. You know, and I kind of wanted to make the point that actually, if people were just doing Scrum by rote, so you know, I'm having a stand-up, and why are you having a stand-up? Because we have a stand-up, because our manager tells us. It's missing the point entirely. And what I repeatedly get asked to do is go into companies, and I was drawing this out in this conference, which is why I've entitled today is How Lean is My Scrum, essentially, or how lean was my Scrum, because it's an evolution, and we'll get onto that shortly. And when I actually look at, when I go into companies and talk with teams historically inside Capita, although far less now, mostly inside Capita, this just isn't an issue now. I was basically getting this really weird conversation going, and it was, we want to be agile and we use Excel for tracking our data. And I'm like, okay, Excel is a tool. There are 1,000 other tools available. You selected that one, fine. And they're like, what can we track in Excel under Agile? And I'm like, oh, okay, that's an odd question, but let's run with it, because I like to know where these questions go. Because if you don't understand the position and organization of the company, or ourselves as agile practitioners, where we are and what we're struggling with and what we're successful with, then you end up in the situation where you basically have to suffer in silence because something's wrong and you can't figure it out. Anyway, and the conversation will always, every single time, would go like this. It would be, is there something we can track in Agile? And somebody in the room would go, well, I've heard of story points. And somebody would say, well, points are numbers. I can add numbers up. I can track numbers. Brilliant. Deliver points. Deliver lots of points. And yeah, that story over there that's worth 5 points, can you deliver that one because it's worth more points than this one that's worth 2 points? And I'm like, okay, that's one way of seeing the world, but have you heard of complexity and unknowns? And this just stops the conversation dead. And they're sort of like, well, what do you mean? We're working out the number of points and we're delivering this number of points. And I'd be like, well, hang on a minute. One definition of a story point, not the only, but it's a measure of complexity, or in other words, how unknown something is. Like if someone turns around and says, I've got this story and I'm dead cert it's a one pointer, it's a teeny tiny t-shirt size. Then you turn around and go, okay, it's probably not too complex. You can probably pretty much definitely deliver it within an iteration, whether you're using sprints or another measure. And probably a low number of unknowns, because you kind of feel really certain you've done the research and you know that area. Whereas if someone turns around and says it's 5, 13 or 20 points, what they're really saying is that they don't know. Their uncertainty is going up, probably because the complexity is going up. And if you have increasing complexity, or a perception of complexity of layers upon layers in the cake, you get this really unknown situation. And that would then lead on to me saying, well, what you're doing there is, when you say track points and deliver higher value stories with higher value story points, you're saying deliver more complexity, make your systems more complex, and deliver more uncertainty. And I'd be like, is that really what you want to be doing? And then I'd always pop up and turn around and go, well, have you heard about deliberate discovery and behavior-driven development and Dan North and everyone else? And literally the result I would get from that would be, you what? People going, well, it's Agile. Agile says I must use Scrum and I must use story points. And I'm like, okay, now I see what the problem here is. You have been indoctrinated in some way by the cargo cult of Scrum as it is marketed. And I'm not having to go at Scrum. I'm having to go at the way that Scrum is marketed across the industry. Essentially, Scrum won the marketing wars of Agile and all that. So Scrum has this concept of story points, potentially. Other measures are available. And you have selected that one because you can use it in Excel or your other tracking tool, and you can tally them up and add them and do nice pie charts. And that's what you think you want to do. So you're going to measure the volume of work done, not the value of work done. Whereas if you have conversations and you understand and you reduce uncertainty and you start thinking about what is the value we can be delivering, that's a much more interesting place, because now we're focused on delivering value, not, weirdly, focusing on delivering uncertainty. It's maximal value for ideally minimal effort, rather than maximal effort points, let's call it, for uncertain value. And this is a conversation I've had many times before. This culminated, by the way, in the latter part of 2019. I decided because I didn't have any Agile certification, I had specifically stopped getting certifications because I was almost fed up of being semi-indoctrinated into one cargo cult or another that I was seeing around. And I come from a software testing background, 20 odd years, and the ISEB and ISTQB foundation and the intermediate and the advanced levels of software testing, I did the first two, and crikey, the indoctrination into an awful, horrendous 20-year out-of-date methodology or pseudo methodology for doing testing that's inside those qualifications. If I could change one thing in my career, it would be to go back and not have done those qualifications. So anyway, so I'm really nervous about doing certified Scrum product owner course, But I came across Martine Devote, and who's this amazing thought leader and practitioner in the Agile space. She was around back when, Scrum was first, let's call it, invented back in the early 90s. Yeah, and she's running this course with Skills Matter. And I thought, fantastic, 2 days uninterrupted with Martine. And this culminated with her asking me to co-present at the end of the conference, which dovetailed straight after the end of the training course. And Martine had this really straightforward concept. She said, look, most companies, when they talk about Agile, they now mean Scrum. Scrum has just won, as I said earlier, the marketing wars. And she hates this because they're following a rigid set of thou shalt do this, thou shalt have a sprint. You must never vary your sprint length, And I always say, well, why not? If I can deliver value this week, but next time it's going to take me slightly longer. Well, as long as I'm having a good quality conversation with my stakeholders, my product owners, my clients, whoever, then as long as they are geared up to accept a changing cadence, and my team has been skilled up, mentored and coached and given the flexibility and freedom to work in such a way, then why should we not do that? Why should I hold on to value today for another week that I could have given to you? And so Martine does not like this Agile exactly equals Scrum exactly equals Agile. And she brought up this things basically. There's a famous diagram, which is basically a picture of a pipe, and underneath, rough translation, it says this is not a pipe. And so she's appropriated that and said essentially this is not a Scrum, or this is not Scrum. And it's a very strong point that she's making, because where is your agility in that? If your Agile equals Scrum equals Agile, where is your agility? Now, again, I'm not having a go at Scrum. I'm having a go at the way Scrum is marketed and I would say, unfortunately, misunderstood in many organizations. But, I could replace Scrum here with Kanban as well. And there are incidents that I've heard of Kanban being used in this incredibly bad way as well. We've got this Kanban board. And you go, well, what does a Kanban board mean? It's a storage place where stories go to die, and they sit on the Kanban board forever. And you go and say, well, what about WIP limit? What about flow and cadence? And you just look at the in progress column and it's got 50 items in it, and the team's only 20 people inside, or 10 people or whatever. It's not just a Scrum thing, but Scrum's the big one. So it's going to get the lion's share of the conversation today. Now, what I'm really saying here is that Agile principles have been forgotten. And through my training, my experience, my background, my exposure to amazing people across the industry at conferences and other events, I remember walking literally halfway across, it seemed like London, I'm sure it was less than that, but it seemed like halfway across London, with a couple of people, because we wanted to get to a conference, to get to an after conference event. And walking along, talking to people about Agile and how we're going to deliver things, it's a great eye opener. You're out of the office space, you can just have this good conversation. And there's this realization that myself and others, quickly came to, and I'm sure this is, it's not revolutionary for the industry, but in my journey, Agile principles are basically lean principles. Look, if you look at the principles inside the Agile Manifesto, which is an all right document, I think 20 years later definitely needs an update, but it's a good starting place. The highest priority is to satisfy your customer or your client, highest, right at the top. Nothing else matters as much as that, and you should do it in a simple way. Well, lean says that. Lean says very, very straightforward. Lean thinking is, value in lean is roughly defined as, is it something the customer, the client is willing to pay for? If they're willing to pay for it, they want it. So the highest priority is to give them the things they want to satisfy the customer. That's lean thinking. And likewise with simplicity, lean removes unnecessary work. There's the 7 in brackets 8 different types of lean waste out there. And you can look at your projects, you can look at your products, you can look at your teams, your individuals and yourselves. And I do the same with this all the time. And I remove waste. I just put a bit of a jokey thing up on Twitter where I looked at my desk here. I'd love to be able to pick up my laptop and pan it round. But I've essentially got 4 monitors on my desk and 2 keyboards and 2 mice. And everything ends up in this random order because I can project anything onto any monitor, essentially. And I can move my keyboards anyway. So I put this jokey thing up on Twitter, and it's there now, where I kind of diagrammed out what I've got. And essentially I've got computer 1, monitor 1, computer 2, monitor 1. It kind of goes alternate like this, both across my monitors and my keyboard and my mouse. And it's a nightmare trying to use it. So identified that is a source of waste. That's a waste of motion. I'm forever having to move things around. So one of my jobs this weekend is to sort that out, because I want a simpler process. I'm actually going to try and work out how to use just one keyboard and mouse across both computers I use for work, and so we'll see how that goes. Anyway, so lean removes waste and lean makes things simpler. That's an agile principle. I like that. And you see this all over. You know, I talked about in my talk, and I think this is really important to bring out, that if you're going to get if you're going to get an agile consultant in, and the first thing they say is Scrum, sack them, throw them out the door straight away. Go into your nearest coffee shop and hire the person who's behind the till working as a barista, because a barista gets throughput, they get flow, they get cadence, they get limiting working process as well. And you look at these amazing ways that coffee shops are organized. There are things there that all add to the value. They add to my experience. You know, you can see the coffee being ground, that lovely smell from when everything is mixed up and percolated together. And, you know, they have, upsell capability. You can buy their bags of coffee or the cakes that are on the counter, etc. Beautifully ornate menus and things like this. That's an experience, and I'm willing to pay for that. That's valuable to me. That's quite interesting, because that means that pretty much myself, and I'm guessing most people on this talk tonight, will happily pay £3 or more for what is essentially a bit of brown powder and milk swirled in a cup. You know, yeah, it's a crazy amount of money for what you're actually getting physically, but the experience that goes behind it, the smell, the aroma, the ability to chat with friends in the coffee shop, when or if that is ever a thing again, of course, that's what we're paying for, essentially. You know, I'd like to point out, though, this picture, there is one stupid thing there. Who on earth puts a chair directly in front of the till, meaning no one else can get to the till? So, you know what, it's not a perfect picture of how to run a coffee shop, but it's sort of 90% there. So I talked about in this talk baristas as being perfect. Now, why did I do that? What I'm trying to say here is that I've kind of been on this journey myself of going, let's call it, from water foolishness to agility. And this started, years ago, the start of my career. I said I did the ISEB Foundation in software testing at the time, which taught me there is this way to do software called waterfall. And there's a thing called the V model, and that's pretty much it. And Agile, that's something for developers. Don't go there, there be dragons. And that influenced me for the first 2 or 3 years, I would say. And my agility took a little while to get going. But blimey, once I started realizing that there was this other way to do things, you don't have to listen to everything that is being said in the marketplace about waterfall, about V model, about agile, essentially. And that's an interesting idea, that if Scrum.org or Scrum Alliance say something, or Kanban University says something, it may not be the best thing in my context, because everything is context specific. Well, that's very interesting, because that means I do not necessarily have to follow the rules. And here's a shocker for you, right? I've got one of my teams who do not do retrospectives. They have chosen that retrospectives are not an effective means for them to learn from each other and to rapidly improve what they do. Instead, that team has got a little chat going on Microsoft Teams at work all the time. I actually had to remember to turn off my other monitor in case it showed up, because the chat is on that monitor at this time. And they will talk about improvements that they can make, and they will just implement them. And of course, there's the other side to a retrospective, which is not just about finding improvements. It's also about that kind of social aspect and supporting each other, and how we as a team can we learn and grow together. Well, they do that as well over Teams, and they do that continuously. In fact, coronavirus is actually quite good for that team. It's encouraged their use of technology in this way. So their background very much is they have realized that they do not need to do retrospectives. And I had this problem. So this, they've been doing that now for a year or two like that. So in my career, my water foolishness is going down, my agility is going up, and then suddenly it plateaus. And I stopped learning, and I couldn't figure this out. I was like, several years ago, I'm going back 8 years ago now, give or take, something like that. I could not work out why I could not get 2-week sprints to work. I could not work out why my potentially shippable increment could never be shipped, and I just didn't get it. Something was wrong. And I had a bit of a brainwave movement that over the course of about 6 months to a year, I just started reading. I started going to as many conferences, reading as many different papers online as possible. And this happened. Suddenly my agility, I would call it, forked upwards incredibly. and my water foolishness, let's call it, my ability to, either I'm doing waterfall by rote or Scrum by rote or Kanban or whatever by rote, but without really understanding the context, that all fell off a cliff. And there were 4 things that caused this. And if you've come across some of these, brilliant. If you've not come across some of them, honestly, go Google. It's amazing. So lean. I'm taking everybody on this course. Everybody on this talk has probably heard of lean, or definitely heard of lean. I'm not going to go into that, especially at the moment. But if you look at things like behavior-driven development, amazing methodology of discovering unknowns and reducing uncertainty. Dan North and Chris Matz came up with this in 2003. So it's almost, not quite, but almost as old as the Agile Manifesto. It's been around for a while. Teams get BDD wrong as well. It took me a couple of years to work out how to use it effectively. There was an especially awful talk I did, let's call it 6-7 years ago, talking about how much complexity I could build into test cases for BDD, let's say. I was learning, completely got that wrong. It was Liz Keogh, amazing Agile consultant, who kind of took me aside and kind of set me on the right path there. Anyway, and then you have other concepts like real options. Now, real options is this great way of thinking about things. Everything is an option. And when do we make commitments? And when does the value in my commitment expire? And can I preserve that? What action can I take to preserve or delay making a decision until the last possible moment? Of course, that ties in slightly with the just-in-time concepts that surround Kanban as well. And then you've got Cynefin, where you're looking at complexity and how complicated or simple, or are you in the chaotic domain, etc. So Cynefin is a very, very good way of kind of passing things up and thinking, do I understand what it is I don't understand, or do I understand the volume or the complexity that I do not understand, essentially? It's a great way of feeding into a deliberate discovery 3 Amigos style workshop. So those really were the 4 things that drove me forwards. They are my agility, essentially. So let's talk about background here, because I think this has a lot of relevance to today. If I go back to 1999, I was working for an environmental charity over in Bristol, and I was basically their IT department. And they were writing some schools multimedia software. And this schools multimedia software became semi-famous across the across various trade shows for 2 things, and 2 things only. It had a section in it where the idea was you were walking around this virtual school and learning about energy efficiency in a school. And there was a bit where you go into the basement of the school, and it became this like 3D rendered, a bit like Doom or Quake, as you kind of go down the corridors, and that bit got demoed at these trade shows. And the other thing that got demoed, bizarrely, was a virtual fish tank. And I designed that fish tank. I'd almost say that's the most fun thing I've done in my entire career. I put the fun factor up there, up to maximum. I am crazy into, at the time, this is two and a bit decades ago now, I'm crazy into designing fish, basically, for a fish tank. I'm spending weeks designing fish, and the company was going, yeah, design the fish, incredibly interesting. Not efficient, because by it took us months to deliver some virtual fish in a fish tank. It's ridiculous, and definitely not delivering a better product there. I'm not working with people, I'm not understanding the value or anything else behind it. But I had no knowledge of there was any other way to do things here. So working on this virtual fish tank, and these fish are let out into the wild, let's say. They go to these conferences and these education trade shows, and would you believe it, it's the 3D Doom rendered bit that one of the companies involved in the software creates, and the virtual fish tank that ended up selling the software, which I find is it's a very strange concept. You're buying schools multimedia software because it's got beautifully rendered fish and a bit of Doom. Where is the value? People didn't really understand what multimedia software really should be. Anyway, I moved on from there. I thought, next job, I'm going to get a proper IT job. So I'm working for a company that does pensions administration software. And throughout my career, I seem to keep getting dragged back into finance and pension software, which I must admit, I don't find interesting at all. I just seem to be quite good at it in terms of knowledge, coming from that background where they trained me up in pensions administration and stuff. So, here I am in 2001 at this new job. It's not fun, it's not interesting, but we're being a bit more efficient now. We understand customer needs. We're, making sure we are customer focused. The problem we are having is trying to deliver. And the reason we're not delivering very well, or at all in some cases, is because we are focused on the software that we are creating. So as a technology team, we understand the value, we bring the value into the business, we code that value, and then we go around in circles over and over again, trying to improve that piece of value. There's no, and when are you going to ship it? And when are you going to send it out the door? And that's not really what you need. What you need in a business, what you need as an individual is you need to be engaged and delivering a better product, and you need to be doing that efficiently, and you need to be doing that working with your customers. What we do here is we collect the requirements, customers will then kind of put in the car park, so to speak, and they would never get spoken to again until the software magically went out the door, in brackets 6-9 months later. So I look back now, and if I was doing that same software again today, I would release at 10 times the cadence easily. They release in once a year roughly, and at worst I would release today at once a month. That's at worst. I'll probably release a lot faster than that with that software tech stack built at that time. So if I roll forwards now, I'm going to go through these a bit quickly, but 2005, I started working for Centennial Software in Swindon, which sadly no longer exists. It was bought by a company called Front Range. Now, Centennial taught me how to do amazing things very efficiently with technology and to really build fantastic products. I was working with people who actually coded DR-DOS, which essentially one way or the other became MS-DOS, or was his leading competitor, one or the other. I was working with people who set up Coral and were leading engineers at Novell, etc. They were really teaching me technology and really teaching me how to get into software systems. Fantastic. So of course the fun factor, the fun is going back up there, definitely. Bit of efficiency, but we're still not being that efficient. We're still taking months to deliver because we are following a pure waterfall process. But we're also following an agile process, so that doesn't quite make sense. And this is kind of what I was saying in that graph earlier, where everything is leveling out. We're getting to a point of demonstrating some agile principles, but it's based around this waterfall wrapper, essentially. So it's sort of like that Scrum fall kind of situation. So we're very limited in what we can do. When I roll forward, so in 2012, I joined Capita, and like all companies, it's had its ups and its downs and everything else, but on the whole, pretty good, because I immediately started working with a project for the pensions regulator. And there you go, pensions have come back into it again. I've managed to escape pensions at this point for about 5 or 6 years, I think, and suddenly I'm back into pensions. And working for the pensions regulator, we had a monumental milestone acceptance criteria document that was I can't remember now. I'm just going to call it, no, I do remember. It was 400 milestone acceptance criteria. I remember that now. And they all had to be delivered, and there was no exception. And we went through these and went, but some of that software makes no sense in your context. You can't use it. You just won't be able to get any value out of it. And we were sort of getting the table. It's in the milestone acceptance criteria. The contract says. We backed them away from that. We actually managed to get that government department, pension regulator, to agree that even though the contract said there was a particular deliverable, if in hindsight it was realized that that deliverable did not equal value, that we could drop it, or we could defer it, or we could evolve it and change it. And this was an absolute first for them, because they were very, very wedded to these milestone acceptance criteria documents, and understandably so. It's when you're working in that kind of, there's lots of dollar signs, you're worried about are your suppliers going to deliver? You want to kind of like a bit of a stick to control your suppliers with. So quite an engaging conversation with them. So we were able to deliver better products as a result. And then this has kind of gone forwards as well. I did some work down at Southampton City Council back in 2016, where I rolled up on day one, and sadly the team had been trying to program this database for 5 sprints, and I was like, why are you doing this? And they were, because we have to get to a potentially shippable increment. I'm like, oh, there's so much misunderstanding there if you've taken 10 weeks to try to program a database. So I just said, where's the value? There is no value attached to it at that point. So we did lots of work. I did lots of work with them looking at value. And this is what I'd encourage everyone is, it's about your efficiency of finding your value. Or another way to put it is, you can't be agile if you do not focus on value. So I do not care how many times people say my increment is potentially shippable. My only question back to that is, great, when are you going to ship it? Because when it's shipped, when it's in the hands of the customer, it is valuable. And I said sometimes I might say contentious things about Scrum. I dislike intensely, and I think it's out of date now and needs to be revised, the term potentially shippable increment. I know it doesn't literally always mean exactly that on the tin, but it so often is, where people say, well, I got this thing that I could have shipped if somebody else had done their job, or if some other team had got things together. And you sort of say, well, you've got software that's now sitting on the shelf. How are you going to combine that software with these other things, these practices, processes, these other teams? How are you going to get that software out the door? And they go, I don't know. And you go, well, your software, it was never releasable then. So it's not releasable, it's not maintainable. So why did you bother, essentially? And in Southampton, we changed that around. So we flipped it, that it was value first. So I was having, well, no, that's not fair, actually. The team were having direct conversations with city councillors, members of the public, unions, and employees, and working out what was valuable to each cohort, what was the collective value there, and they were focused on the most valuable things and delivering them. Now they started delivering the most valuable things for the minimum amount of effort. Amazing. So there were 70 plus user journeys delivered there. And that's the thing, it's value with agility. You know, agility without an understanding of, agile without an understanding of value is not agility. It's not even agile in my book. And if I roll forwards, this is where I am now, and it's carrying on with this trend. You know, I kicked off my own product a couple of years ago over at Capita. It's a bit of a cheeky one. I'm firmly of the belief you may as well try something until someone says stop, or it turns out to be a bad idea. So I came up with this idea for this geolocation microservice. I just got a team. You know, I control several teams. So I found some people who were starting to come off various projects. We assembled them into a team. They had some commonality. We spent some time making sure they understood how each other worked and what the good parts and the bad parts, and you know, who needs some coaching, etc. And we got this team working very strongly together, and they fly. And they're not running Scrum or Kanban or XP. They're just delivering using agility, essentially. I could not classify their approach into one specific methodology or not. It takes whatever is appropriate at any point in time. This is great because they ship software. Sometimes they're shipping it several times a week. You know, I've seen 2 or 3 releases going out in one day. So it's not quite continuous delivery, but it's not far off. And that cadence works brilliantly for me, works brilliantly for our customers. They now go live whenever they, not quite when they want, but you know, they go live whenever is appropriate in various contexts, but they do not need to seek approval for me to go live. I've given the team authority and the trust that they can just go live. And this software is used by quite big customers. You know, we've got British Broadcasting Corporation, Gas Safe Register, you know, some fairly big heavyweight organizations are using this as the geolocation APIs that drive their solution. And that team is empowered just to change the software. You know, no need to go through approval processes. They are trusted because they have demonstrated repeatedly for 2 years the ability to go live. You know, that team went live on day one. You know, the very, very first basic version of microservice was delivered. That's what I want, true agility coupled to value, focus on customers. So this is my message. You know, lean agility is maximal value for minimal effort. It's not maximal volume for uncertain value, which, you know, tracking points, or, you know, you must do a potentially shippable increment and it must be done by the end of this sprint, etc. It's where is the value, finding that, removing the uncertainty and delivering it. So this is my last point. What's next? You know, what's next for me? Well, you know, Marvin the Martian here is only because I quite like the graphic, but it's quite a good question. You know, what is next? You know, have I reached peak agile? Have I reached peak lean? Well, no, I haven't. You know, there's a million things out there to learn. So this is my what I'm doing next, and this is what I encourage everyone to do all the time. You know, every week, find yourself half an hour to an hour. Get on Google and just start browsing around, go around Twitter, find some interesting links, you know, start following up things up. You know, I came across this concept called superfast, which is this idea of leading at different speeds. So sometimes you're really getting your team to focus and going at warp speed, and other times you back off and, you know, it's chill out time, etc. And I'm simplifying greatly. It's way more than just that. Turns out by coincidence, complete random coincidence, that's actually written by someone I used to go to school with, a lady called Sophie Devonshire. So I came across that just by randomly searching Twitter as an interesting concept. That's actually how I came across real options as well. So my advice is go out there and find out what's out there in the industry, find out what people are talking about, and engage with that content. But make sure it has value. It has value to you as an individual, value to teams you work with, and potentially value to what you're doing next. So here's a company I'm following intently, SpaceX, possibly the most agile company there is at the moment. If you look at what they have achieved and the time they've achieved this in, essentially, and how they've recovered from failure, how they created a safe to fail space. And I know there's conversations about what kind of manager Elon Musk is, etc. But at the end of the day, he and his company are doing these amazing things with rockets. Quite literally, rockets to the moon, rockets to Mars coming up. That's incredible for a company that is notably under 20 years old. So that's where they've got to in less time than the Agile Manifesto has existed. So what can we evolve in our agility? What value can we discover? And where can we find out great ideas for what we'll be doing in the future? And that's what I'm going to do. And that's what I encourage you all to do as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Colin. That was excellent. I'm sure everyone is giving you a virtual round of applause at the moment. There you go. I see a few people. We've got some time. Did anyone have any questions? Just unmute yourself and shout out.
I'll be very rude and get started, although it's my first time in a meetup, if you guys allow. Yeah.
Never rude to get started. Carry on. Yes, what's your question?
And my question is, you mentioned an example of one of your teams that decided not to do any retrospectives, and you started explaining what their rationale behind it was. I'd like to, go over that again, just to understand it, and how they replace it. What did they replace it with?
Okay, so this comes back down to the value conversation. So from a client point of view, what will I pay for? I'll pay for things that are going to deliver me the stuff I want. And the question is, does a retrospective do that? In certain contexts, it does, because it enables us to discover better, more efficient ways of working. It gives the team a breather, etc. But in other contexts, and this is the key point here, specifically in the context of this one team, and that's why I called it out as one team, they have worked with their clients and they have worked out that the best way for them to iterate improvements is quite literally continuously. So they have a conversation on Microsoft Teams, and somebody says, I've got this great idea. I notice we keep doing this thing. The classic one was, why on earth are we always having to manually copy build files? Can't we just write a stupid script to do that? And the answer is, well, of course we can. Why did no one suggest that before? Who cares? Doesn't matter. It's not a blame game. Please go and write that script. And someone just got on with it and did it. I didn't approve that. I didn't, that conversation happened, when I wasn't even in the office. So the team had that idea to improve that. That improved their ability to deliver quickly into an acceptance test environment that week, that day, that hour, essentially. So the very, very next build that went through into acceptance test got through in less than an hour, whereas previously it was taking like 2 or 3 hours because people manually copying files and making mistakes. That's value to the customer, because that's more immediately they get the software they want. And it's valuable to the team because they found an improvement that makes their lives easier. The other side, of course, of retrospectives is that conversation, that collaboration, that learning from each other. A retro should never be run as tell me what went well and what went wrong. And by the way, I'm a developer, so all the testers are wrong, or I'm a tester, so it was the developer's fault. And I've seen retros of various companies, turn into that kind of finger pointing. The great thing about collaboration over something like Microsoft Teams is you can just have those kind of general chit chats. You can just have a quick private conversation with someone saying, I think I've got this idea, but I'm not sure if it's a good one or not. And you can act as a sounding board rather than a team getting into a room every 2 weeks where they're almost like forced to chat to each other, even if they're not confident about doing that in that environment. And it's quite intimidating. If you're not a natural public speaker, it's quite intimidating to talk in front of people. I've been doing it for years. And it still scares me completely. I'm trying not to swear here. It still scares me, let's say. But I've learned a way to do that. I'm a complete introvert by nature, but I've learned to do this. Many people haven't. So an option, an alternate way of doing it works well. That team, the personality types, horrible phrase, mostly prevalent in that team, the way they're working with the client, they are better suited to never doing a formal retrospective and just having those collaborative, continuous improvement and learning conversations together. So that's a long answer to a very good question.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. That gives me a lot of
context. Can I say it's context? Again, I'm never saying don't do Scrum, don't do retros. I'm saying if your context is that retros in a particular way or retros at all are not working, challenge that. Is there something else? Or is there a different way you can be improving and working together to become more collaborative?
Think outside the Scrum box.
Yeah. First word that comes to my mind is empowerment of teams, and probably also to a certain degree psychological safety. I don't know.
Well, totally. You know, that particular team is more psychologically safe, they feel, behind a computer keyboard over Microsoft Teams and stuck in a room. You know, fine. You know, I'm not gonna force people who literally do not like raising their hand, so to speak, and chatting in front of their peers physically in a room, but are quite comfortable to do that virtually. I'm not going to make them sit in a room, do a 2-week, a retro at the end of every sprint. Now, of course, you can do, retros virtually, and many teams are now probably around the world given coronavirus. But again, that's still sitting in a room. You know, this is a room. I'm trying to pointing to my other monitor here, so I'm just going to drag this over. You know, but if I drag this onto the screen, you know, oops, there is a bit of the room. You know, there's half a dozen or so of us in this room. I can kind of sort of point. That's very challenging for people. If your team, if your client's context, if your team's psychological safety barriers, let's call them, does not support this way of interaction, don't inflict it upon them.
Thanks.
Any other questions? You know, and by the way, challenge me. I speak as I'm speaking from authority. Hell no. You know, this is stuff that I've come across and works for me in my context and is designed as a polite challenge to things that people might have thought they always have to do.
Yeah, Colin, I have a question, if that's all right.
Yeah.
You mentioned earlier there were a couple of concepts that you discovered. Particularly, I think you highlighted BDD, Lean, Real Options, and Cynefin.
Yeah.
That really helped you to accelerate your journey. What was it specifically about those? Like, how did your day-to-day practice change as a result of you discovering those concepts?
So I come from a testing background, so there's a natural overlap clearly between, let's say, the right-hand bit of behavior-driven development, i.e. the test automation bit, and clearly test automation. So that was a natural avenue in for me where I went, crikey, this is a way for me to write automated test cases that for once in my life, a BA will actually understand, you know, because here I am doing, well, it wasn't Selenium at the time, it was whatever tool, you know, I think QA Run or something, you know, but I'm writing all this VBA code or this Python code, and I'm going to a BA and I'm going, is this what you want? Or I'm doing keyword-driven testing and it's 1,000 test cases because I can auto-generate them. So why would I not generate 1,000 test cases? Again, give it to a BA or a client and going, are these the correct test cases? And you know, I can't review that complexity. That's too long. BDD enabled me to stop doing that and to have that conversation about what's the value, what's the important thing to do. Now, I'll be honest, I got it completely wrong, like properly wrong. So for the pension regulator, I wrote this automated test framework alongside a developer that was pseudo BDD, you know, given when then, but it was API testing and state transition testing in a stateless state machine, curiously. And it had 1,500-ish tests in there, combining 60,000 test steps. Now, if you've got 1,000 test cases and you've got given when then, you clearly should have 3,000 steps. Yeah, that's 1 times 3, 1,000 times 3. I had 60,000, so I completely missed the mark. It worked beautifully. Software 100% reliable. I mean, like properly reliable. You know, the minimum pass rate for that software going live was 100% of those test cases had to 100% pass, and other things had to pass as well. And we hit that 2 weeks before the deadline of the project. Problem was, going back to what I was saying earlier about releasable and maintainable, that's not maintainable. So I felt so bad for one of my teams about 2 years ago when they've inherited this nightmare that I created, and they basically had to refactor it into an entirely different way of working because all the legislation behind pensions had changed. So I was buying tons of donuts. So that was my way into BDD, the wrong way. I now understand about deliberate discovery. I now understand about finding unknowns and finding the specific examples are important. And like real options was the thing that helped me understand that, because you know, under real options, your options expire, options have value, don't commit early unless you know why. So why am I writing this specific example now and committing to this example that the software must do this? Do I have enough information to make that critical judgment call? If I don't, then I need to have a further conversation. Somebody else needs to give me some advice. So I was using concepts of like real options to try and not let's just say write, you know, awful, you know, like classic one, do the BDDs, you know, write endless test cases. That's not what BDD is at all. So I learned from that by using real options to kind of govern my own thought process. And then Cynefin very much looking at the difference between complexity and something is complicated. So real quick one for those who don't know Cynefin. So if something is complicated, it probably means we sort of done it before, we've probably got a technical idea of how to do it, it's just a hard thing to do. We might need to borrow Bob or Sarah, and they can come over and they can be the people that guide us. A complex problem is something we haven't got a clue how to do, or we have very little idea, and we need to do probes, we need to do investigations and experiments. And that's a wonderful idea, because it's a way of identifying when you should do, or when you should likely do an experiment, when you should, you know, look at doing a spike, for example. If you don't have that as a concept, you get the two mixed up. You start saying things are complicated or complex when they're the other way around. And the classic one there is where you get a tester saying, I refuse to test the software unless the BA writes down every single possible permutation of how the software should work in the database. Or, you know, so you now got a BA who's perhaps not so technical, trying to define the technicality that the developer and the tester work from. And then the developer and tester have to guess what the requirement is. That's getting the complexity and complexity and complicatedness of the software mixed up. So it's things like that, essentially. You know, I'm not, so I give very long answers. I need a buzzer that says interrupt.
That's right. It's quite interesting. So the way that you were looking at BDD is to help with your decision making. Yeah, and Cynefin and real options are both decision making tools. So it seems like you were looking for a little bit more certainty in the world at that point.
Yeah, absolutely. And they are also governing tools. So they're part of governing constraints with me as well. So, you know, like one of the things in real options, as I was saying, is never commit early unless you know why. And you can apply that to absolutely anything. You know, I've got a super secret, top secret thing I'm working on at work, which I hope becomes the, oh crikey, I hope it becomes the next Mars rocket, let's say. It's on the screen there. I mean, it's not a rocket, you know, I haven't got a clue about building rockets. But if it goes in the way I think it could, then it could be a, OMG, everybody around the planet is screaming about this thing, you know, and it probably won't, you know, it's an idea. It's something we need to run tests upon. But is it a complex thing? Is it a complicated thing? Or does it look like a solution might be so simple we completely miss the boat and we fall over into that domain of chaos in Cynefin, where everything it starts becoming unknown and goes wrong? I'm using ideas like Cynefin to govern my thought process and think about where am I, where are my teams, and I'm helping educate my teams to think, I don't want to say think in a similar way, that implies we will blink a light, but at least to have these concepts that help back up their decision making as well. In other words, if I am making a decision to do X or not to do X, that must be based on evidence, first and foremost. Secondly, it's the quality of the evidence, and the quality of the evidence is predicated on what I do not know, the unknowns. So of course, BDD, deliberate discovery, unknowns, Cynefin, complexity, etc., they all help with finding the unknowns. That's really important to me. I think that should be important to absolutely everybody.
I agree. Thank you very much.
Any other questions? And I'll try and give short answers.
I like your long answers, and I have a couple of ones. So one that's really interesting to me is I've always had arguments with my brother, who comes from a hardcore agile background, and me from a lean manufacturing background. I was before that for a long time in manufacturing. Which one comes from the other, and how different they are? How do you live through? You said you use BDD and Cynefin and real options, but also lean. Could you give us examples for how do you instantiate or understand or allow for freedom of implementation of lean principles?
Yeah, so okay, so if I was to talk like pure lean manufacturing, you know, we'd all bring up that picture of the you know, like the suitcase where you keep your tools, and it's all got the cutouts, and you know, your spanner must go there, and you know, everything's got to be very uniform and organized, and that is a view of the world a view of the world, not the only view of the world, but a view of the world under lean manufacturing, where you're trying to uniform and standardize processes to remove waste. Again, it's an unknown. I got this tool and I need to work on it over here, or maybe I put it over there, and where did the tool go, and did Sarah borrow the tool? Those are all versions of one or two ways under lean. Lean removes all of that, fantastic, but there is a danger of removing too much. I would say that you shouldn't become so lean that you're removing the fun and the interest and the investigation from what you're doing. You're focused on the value. So the two core things I pull out from lean are focus on the value. If you do not know what the value is, just don't proceed, essentially. And so I now have teams that when they take a story into an iteration, I'm purposely saying iteration, not sprint, because they may not be running Scrum, but they take it into their iteration for development. When they take that in, one of the first things they ask about is they say, is it releasable? Is it maintainable? Is it valuable? How do they know it's valuable? How have they qualified that? In comes BDD. What conversations have we had? Have we had to use the concept of three amigos? Have we engaged with our client or the stakeholders that represent the client? Are we engaging with and this is where ideas can ever in thinking about, am I asking the right questions to people as well? So am I asking the right clients? Sorry, the right people. The client is the person paying the bills. So under lean, it's the value they want. But are they the people that are going to be using this? And I was in a conversation, crikey, when was this? This was 6 years ago. No, more than that, because I've been at Capita for 8 years now. 10 years ago, +4, sorry. 10 years ago, pre-Capita. And I'm in this room and there's a manager in the room from a client who pays the bills. So they had their understanding of value. And there was a union representative who quite literally represented the people who had to use a mobile workforce solution that we're producing. And they disagreed entirely on what value was. I am paying for this software. I want it to be in blue. Well, no, I'm the one that's using it or representing those that are using it. We want it in pink, kind of thing. It was one of those conversations. And the two of them went off like two nuclear bombs in this room. And I'm just there going, what on earth did I say? And the only thing I said is, what do you want to use the software for? Manager wants to use it for reporting. Other person wants to use it to make their job easy and get on with their job. And because they're a union representative, they also did not want people to lose their jobs because of too much efficiency. So they wanted a cap on efficiency. Management does not want a cap on efficiency as much. It's that horrible conversation. So lean is a fantastic way of bringing concepts in, like waste minimization and elimination, and focusing on value. But to understand if you're focusing on the right value for the right people, you've got to have the right conversations. Behavior-driven development is a method that enables you to do that. Other methods are available, under that. So that's one of the ways I bring that in. I hope that gives kind of an answer to that as well. There are many other ways I link the two together and other concepts as well, but that would be a good example of that. What was your other question, Maro?
Definitely. I mean, I don't want to go down the rabbit hole of lean and hijack the discussion, but you should definitely give more talks.
Feel free to hijack the discussion with lean from my point of view. This is South Wales Agile Group. Let's call it South Wales Lean Group. Yeah. So, what was your other question?
Well, in that case, I understood you have different teams, and I understood they have a certain level of, let's say, freedom. How they come up with their own flavor of Agile, I would say. That's what I hear.
Yeah, totally.
And so with regard to lean, how do you communicate this not only to the leadership, which, understands it probably as efficiency, hey, let's get points in less time with less resources and less testing and less defects, and blah, blah, the metric wars, and to the teams. How do you deal with this hamburger syndrome?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'll pick on one example, because otherwise, as you say, we will be talking about one concept all night. So I'm going to talk about doing less testing. So this is great because I could talk about this quite literally for hours, coming from a 20-year testing background kind of thing. So doing less testing, when someone says, well, I could use a low-code, no-code solution, or I could use Agile, or I could use BDD, or I could use lean practices, or whatever it is, I could use X. Let's call it all of that, and everything else, we just call it X. I can use X to do less testing. And then I say, okay, well, that's a statement based on the fact that you already understand the question that led to that answer, because the answer is do less testing. Okay, well, what was the question? And they say, well, the question is, how do we reduce the number of testers, or how do we be more efficient? And I'm like, well, hang on a minute. So the reason you're reducing the amount of testing is because you're asking the question, how do we reduce the amount of testers? Well, that's easy. You just sack them all, you know. I'm a software tester that's been put at risk of redundancy a few times in my career. So been there, almost done that kind of thing, you know. But that's crazy. That's a cyclic argument. That's how do we do less of X by getting rid of X? Well, simply you just stop it, you know. The better conversation is go, can we deliver the same value or better value, however you define better, with less X? And the answer is yes, but a better way of answering that question is we've started by saying with different testing. So I've seen, for example, testers move from using, let's call it pressing the same button over and over again, manual testing, to automation using keyword-driven development, to a sort of a pseudo TDD, BDD, to proper conversations, and then actually getting to the point where we are now handing the testing over to other parts of the business or our stakeholders. We have one project at the moment where we're pretty much not writing test cases above a traditional unit and component integration testing, API tests aside. I'm talking about UI stuff here. And the UI tests are purely written by the client and they're purely run by the client, but we have an automated test framework that understands the plain English and where we need extra step definitions. Yes, that's a BDD framework. Those are going in. So we completely subverted, we've kind of gone from BDD as pure testing to BDD as conversations, back to BDD as testing because the conversation is purely with the client. And the client is writing those tests in advance of what we're doing. So this is great. So we can now start saying, yes, we'll have less of one type of testing because it frees up time for another type of testing. Or the other classic one is, why does no one ever do performance testing? It's because it's hard. I'm not a non-functional tester. And by the way, it's got the word non in it, which I misunderstand to mean low value. And you say, well, hang on a minute, you want to release a system that's not performant, that won't live up in the real world? And so you can say, well, rather than doing all this button clicking or this crazy number of automated keyword-driven test cases, which just do not demonstrate value because they trip over each other, they barely run, they're testing the same thing ad infinitum. You know, if I see another test suite with, you know, with 20, 30, 50 test cases to test the login function, I'm just gonna be like, why are you doing that? You know, that's a problem that was solved decades ago, you know, in testing. It really was. Instead, maybe take that resource, that cost, because resource is essentially dollar signs or pound signs, and redeploy it, retrain people if need be, you know, because we don't want to make people redundant. We want to find work for people where we can and give them the skills in performance testing. Because we're always saying we don't do performance testing. We're always saying that's something as an industry of testers that's somebody else's problem because it's non-functional. No, let's make it our problem. Let's make it the team's problem. Let's get our agile team, you know, of whatever flavor they are, and they can be running the performance test cases, you know, from day one. Now that brings in another concept from Lean as well. So we want to reduce rework in Lean. Well, that's great because Agile we want to reduce rework. Lean, we want to reduce rework, and forget both of those. Customers just don't like rework. You know, why? I don't want to pay for something twice. I certainly don't want delays in release. So performance always ends up being rework. You leave it to the end of a project and then the system doesn't perform and then there's this mad scramble to fix things. Why not instead do performance testing from day one? That GeoAd product that I mentioned, geolocation software, the very first test case we ran was a performance test case when we had no environment to run the test case on. We treated it almost like pseudo BDD, the idea of you run it, it fails, that proves it will at least find a failure. You then write the minimum amount of code to make the test pass. The minimum amount of code we wrote was to make it performant before it was functionally correct, which is a really odd way of thinking things. So you can redeploy that investment of resource. So then you have the question, do I want to reduce the cost and increase the risk? Or do I want to reduce the cost, not increase the risk in performance or security or any other thing that's got the word non on it in testing, and use that instead? That's what I do, you know, all the time. We're always looking for efficiency where we can remove waste from process, we can remove unnecessary expenditure of effort, costs, etc., and we can redeploy it rather than just cutting it, essentially. That's why we've now got teams doing performance from day one, security from day one, etc. Yeah.
There's something very interesting I heard there. Tell me if I'm wrong, but there is a degree of model-driven engineering brought back there to increase the efficiency, right?
Yeah, it is exactly that. You know, you've got to look at different ways of finding efficiency in your processes, your practices, your tooling, and your people, and asking people to be efficient is a very hard thing, because people misinterpret that as work harder, do more hours, and being efficient. I turned around to a team the other day, and it was crazy. They were like, they said, oh well, we're getting towards the end of our sprint. We've got a bunch of bugs we've not yet had time to fix. Do you mind if we lower the priority? And I said, well, you can lower the priority, but you've made a commitment to fix them. So although I can probably get you out of hand to fix them if you really have to, if you think they're lower priority, what you're really saying to the business is that you're not going to meet your commitment. Or you're saying to the business, alternatively, because that's how it will be heard, even though that's not a Scrum thing, that's how the business will hear it. Or you're saying to the business, we volunteer to work until Friday 11 p.m. midnight because we're still going to keep our commitment, but we just bump these other bugs to the end. And I just turned around and I just said, could you automate something on that? Could you just remove something? Could you just make it more efficient so the number of hours per bug, let's say, or minutes per bug decreases so you can get more done in the same amount of time? Where's your efficiency? What can you do to save? And they figured out a couple of things. They got some savings in, and they didn't get them all done. I'm not trying to paint a perfect picture, but they got about 50, 60%. So the message I then had to go back to stakeholders was, let's say 50% less worse at the end of the sprint. Brilliant efficiency, using principles, to improve things, finding where they could automate more stuff in the right way, and they ended up delivering. I like that. I think that's a good way to do things.
That makes the difference between efficiency and agile much more clear to me from your graphs.
Yeah. By the way, my graphs are kind of like my mad ramblings. Everything is a mad rambling, by the way. Yeah. Number one rule: Colin is always wrong, and I literally tell my teams that. And I love this. I get the most junior people in the organization, so graduates that have barely started on their IT journey, and they'll ping me a message over Teams and they say, I don't think that's the right way of doing something because. And as long as they've got the because, as long as they've got a piece of evidence, and it doesn't even have to be, the evidence doesn't have to even be right. They can misinterpret something. That's fine. That's a learning experience for them, and quite often for me as well. I misinterpret things all the time. But we go through that evidence together and we go, oh yeah, look at this. I had a tester turn around and said, I think the cost to host that in Azure is going to be about £25.6 million per year. And I budgeted about 40,000. So of course you can imagine falling off the back of my chair. Oh, crikey, am I going to be the world's biggest embarrassment? I mean, you can imagine going back and asking for CapEx expenditure to go from 40K to 25 million is not going to go down well with any company, and no, it wasn't. The evidence they were using, the calculation, it was a classic thing, they've forgotten to carry the one kind of thing, in the calculation. We went back through the Azure cost model, and myself and that particular tester, who's a performance tester now, so I actually use her as my my Azure finance guru, I suppose you could say. Whenever we do something in Azure, she'll have a look at it and she'll be able to tell us, are we going completely, the wrong way? And that's skills and experience, and that's really important. That's agility in the way people learn as well, more than anything.
Thanks a lot. So much to process. Thanks a lot.
It's been recorded. So it's been recorded. So just for record, everything I say is wrong. Yeah.
Thank you, everyone, for your questions. I think we'll wrap it up there. As Colin said, this is all being recorded, so we'll get this uploaded on and put onto YouTube in the next week or so. Colin, before we wrap up, do you want to let people know where they can find you on Twitter or anywhere else you wish to push?
Absolutely. So you can Twitter and email, good old fashioned thing. So Twitter is @ethicalwebsites with an S on the end, so all one word. And email is just colin.deady, D-E-A-D-Y, so colin.deady@capita.com. And you're more than welcome to ping me a message and tell me I'm wrong.
Fantastic. Thank you again for your time tonight, Colin. Much appreciated. And thank you, everyone else, for joining us. As I said, we'll be back next month. If you've got any Agile games that you want to bring to the table and play, then feel free to do so. And we'll have some lined up from the organisers as well. But thank you again. I'm going to end the recording now and hopefully see you all next month.